Barnaby had opinions about everything. He had opinions about the mailman, he had opinions about squirrels, he had opinions about the neighbor's cat, the garbage truck, the wind, and any living creature that dared to breathe within a 50-foot radius of Avery Hayes. And right now, at 6:15 in the morning on the cold tarmac of Teterboro Airport's private hangar complex, the 6-pound Yorkie had a very loud opinion about the biggest dog he had ever seen in his tiny, furious life. Avery didn't even see it happen. She was pacing near the edge of the runway access road, her phone pressed hard against her ear, listening to her company's chief financial officer explain in painfully polite terms that Hayes Logistics had exactly 11 days before their creditors would begin forced asset seizures. 11 days. That was all that stood between 3 generations of her family's legacy and a complete financial collapse.
"We can restructure the payment timeline," Avery said, her voice tight. "Push the Q3 obligations into Avery. We've pushed everything we can push. There's nothing left to rearrange. The board wants to discuss a full sale." The word sale hit her like ice water. She stopped pacing. "My grandfather built this company from a single delivery truck. We are not selling." "Then we need a miracle in 11 days. Avery closed her eyes and pressed her thumb against the bridge of her nose. She was 26 years old, the youngest VP of operations in the company's history, and she had spent the last 14 months fighting to keep Hayes Logistics alive after her grandfather's passing left a power vacuum that the board had been too slow to fill. Every night she stayed up reviewing freight contracts. Every morning she woke up to another crisis. And now, standing on a freezing New Jersey airfield at dawn, she was being told that none of it mattered. "I'll figure it out," she said quietly. "I always do." She hung up and exhaled a long, shaking breath. That was when she heard the barking. It was the kind of barking that sounded like a squeaky toy being stepped on repeatedly. High-pitched, relentless, and absolutely fearless. Avery spun around, and her stomach dropped. Barnaby had somehow yanked his retractable leash right out of the clip on her bag, and he was now standing in the middle of the walkway between 2 private hangars, legs planted wide, ears flat, barking with every ounce of fury his tiny body could produce. And he was barking directly at a Rottweiler. The Rottweiler was enormous, 110 pounds of solid black and tan muscle, sitting perfectly still on a short leather lead, its massive head tilted slightly to the side, as if it was genuinely trying to understand what this little creature thought it was doing. The dog didn't growl. It didn't lunge. It just sat there with an almost dignified patience, watching Barnaby lose his mind. Holding the Rottweiler's lead was a man. He stood about 6'1", dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit that looked far too expensive for an airport walkway at dawn. His jaw was sharp, his dark hair was pushed back cleanly, and his expression carried the kind of quiet stillness that made the air around him feel heavier. He looked like he could have been a bodyguard, or maybe a private driver waiting for some billionaire's jet to land. His eyes, dark, calm, unreadable, were fixed on Barnaby with something that might have been amusement, though his face barely moved. Avery's protective instincts kicked in before her common sense could catch up. She ran forward, scooped Barnaby off the ground with one arm, and turned on the stranger with the full force of a woman who had already been pushed to her limit before the sun was even fully up. "Are you serious right now?" she snapped. "You're just going to stand here with a dog that size taking up the entire walkway, no muzzle, no warning, nothing? That animal could swallow my dog whole." The man looked at her. Then he looked at Barnaby, who was still growling and squirming in Avery's arms, trying desperately to get back down and continue his stand. Then he looked back at Avery. He said nothing. "Do you speak English?" Avery pressed, her frustration boiling over. "I said your dog is a danger just standing here unleashed like this. There are regulations." "He's on a lead," the man said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to command a room. "A short lead," Avery shot back. "And my dog—" "Your dog," the man interrupted calmly, "walked up to mine, not the other way around."
Avery opened her mouth, then closed it. He was technically right, and that made her even angrier. "That's beside the point," she said through her teeth. The man studied her for a long, quiet moment. His gaze moved from her face to the phone clutched in her white-knuckled grip, to the dark circles under her eyes, to the way her jaw was clenched so tight it could crack a walnut. He seemed to read every ounce of stress radiating off her in a single glance. Then he gave the Rottweiler's lead a gentle tug and stepped to the side, clearing the entire walkway without a word. As he passed her, he paused just long enough to say, "Your dog has courage. That's rare in something that small." Before Avery could respond, a black armored SUV pulled up at the hangar entrance. A driver stepped out and opened the rear door. The man walked toward it, the Rottweiler falling into step beside him with military precision. Avery watched him go, still holding Barnaby against her chest. "Jerk," she muttered. Barnaby barked once more in agreement. She turned away and clipped the leash back onto her bag, shaking her head. Rich people and their ridiculous dogs. Probably some hedge fund manager's personal security detail, she thought. The kind of man who had never worried about losing everything in 11 days. She looked down at Barnaby. "Next time, pick a fight with someone your own size." Barnaby wagged his tail, completely unrepentant. Avery pulled her coat tighter and headed back toward the terminal parking lot, already mentally drafting her next email to the board. She had 11 days to save Hayes Logistics. She didn't have time to think about arrogant strangers with dangerous dogs. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that the man she had just insulted on a cold New Jersey runway had already read every single one of her company's financial filings. He had already reviewed her freight contracts, her distribution routes, and her outstanding debts down to the last decimal. And in exactly 24 hours, Damon Vance was going to walk into her boardroom and take everything. The emergency board meeting was called for 10 o'clock sharp, and by 9:45, Avery already knew something was wrong. The conference room on the 32nd floor of Hayes Logistics headquarters had never felt this tense. Normally, board meetings were dull, predictable affairs. Quarterly earnings, route optimization reports, the usual corporate theater. But today, every chair was filled. The company's general counsel was seated in the corner, with 2 folders she had never seen before. 3 of the senior board members were whispering to each other near the windows, and none of them would look Avery in the eye when she walked in. She sat down in her usual seat, second from the head of the table, and set her laptop open in front of her. "Does someone want to tell me what's going on? I wasn't given an agenda for this meeting." Howard Kessler, the longest-serving board member and a close friend of her late grandfather, cleared his throat. He was 71, silver-haired, and he had the particular expression of a man who was about to deliver news he wished someone else could deliver instead. "Avery, a controlling stake in Hayes Logistics was acquired yesterday evening through a private equity channel, 53%. The room went still. Avery stared at him. 53%. That's a majority. That means the buyer has full decision-making authority over the company, Howard said quietly. Effective immediately. Avery's fingers curled around the edge of the table. Who? Howard glanced toward the double doors at the far end of the conference room. He'll be here any minute. His legal team arrived 20 minutes ago and has already begun reviewing our operating agreements. His legal team is already here and nobody told me? Avery's voice came out sharper than she intended. I'm the VP of operations. I should have been the first call. It happened fast, Avery. The acquisition was completed in under 6 hours. Whoever this man is, he moved faster than anything I've seen in 40 years of business. Avery leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. A hostile acquisition, executed overnight, with enough capital to buy a controlling majority in a company that, despite its financial struggles, still held significant infrastructure contracts across the eastern seaboard. This wasn't some opportunistic investor picking up a cheap asset. This was calculated. This was someone who had done their homework. The double doors opened. 4 attorneys in matching dark suits entered first, each carrying leather briefcases. They fanned out along the far wall like they had rehearsed the entrance. Behind them walked a 5th man, younger than the rest, carrying a single black folder. And behind him, Damon Vance walked into the room. Avery's breath caught in her throat. He was wearing a charcoal suit today, slightly different from the one at the airport, but the effect was the same. That same still, heavy presence, that same unreadable calm in his dark eyes. That same jaw, sharp enough to cut glass, set in an expression that suggested he had already made every decision that mattered before he even stepped through the door. The dog owner. The man with the Rottweiler. The man she had yelled at on a freezing runway in New Jersey less than 24 hours ago. He walked to the head of the table, her grandfather's old seat, the one nobody had sat in since his passing, and pulled back the chair. He sat down without hesitation, as if the seat had been waiting for him his entire life. His eyes found Avery immediately. There was a flicker of recognition, the faintest shift at the corner of his mouth. He remembered her. Of course he remembered her. "Good morning," Damon said, addressing the full table. His voice carried the same low, unhurried authority she had heard on the tarmac, except now it filled a corporate boardroom with the weight of a man who owned everything in it. "My name is Damon Vance. As of 9 p.m. last evening, I hold a 53% controlling interest in Hayes Logistics. I'm here to discuss the restructuring." The room was dead silent. Howard spoke first. "Mr. Vance, the board appreciates the capital injection, but we'll need time to review the terms of—" "The terms are in the folder in front of you," Damon said, nodding toward the black folders his assistant was now distributing around the table. "Page 4 outlines the restructuring timeline. Page 11 covers personnel changes. Everything is already signed on my end. I'm here as a courtesy, not for a negotiation." Avery watched the board members flip open their folders with trembling hands. She didn't touch hers. She was still staring at Damon, her pulse hammering behind her ribs. "You," she said. Every head in the room turned toward her. Damon met her gaze evenly. "Ms. Hayes?" "You were at Teterboro yesterday morning, with the Rottweiler." A brief pause. "I was." "You already knew who I was, at the airport. You already knew you were buying my company, and you stood there and said nothing." Damon tilted his head slightly. "You didn't give me much of a chance to speak. You were busy telling me my dog was a menace." A few of the attorneys shifted uncomfortably. Howard looked like he wanted to disappear under the table. Avery's face burned, but she held her ground. "So this is what, some kind of power play? You buy a majority stake overnight and just walk in here expecting everyone to fall in line?" "Yes," Damon said simply. "That's exactly what this is." The bluntness of it knocked the wind out of the room. Damon opened his own folder and slid a single page across the polished table toward Avery. "I've reviewed your operational reports for the last 18 months. You're the only reason this company hasn't collapsed already. Your route consolidation strategy saved $11 million last quarter alone. So here's what's going to happen. You'll report directly to me as the primary liaison for the restructuring. Every operational decision goes through you first." Avery looked down at the page. It was a formal appointment letter, already typed and dated, with her name printed at the top. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Damon leaned back in his chair and studied her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Then I'll find someone else. But I won't find someone better. And you know that." Avery held his gaze for a long, charged moment. The entire board was watching. She could feel Howard silently begging her not to say anything reckless. She picked up the pen from the table and signed the letter. "Fine," she said. "But if you think owning 53% means you own me, you're going to have a very long restructuring, Mr. Vance." Damon collected the signed page and slipped it back into his folder. "I'm counting on it," he said. Port Newark smelled like diesel fuel, salt water, and rust. Avery stepped out of the company sedan and immediately regretted wearing heels. The ground was a mess of cracked asphalt and old rail tracks, and the wind coming off Newark Bay cut straight through her blazer like it wasn't there. Cargo containers were stacked 6 high in every direction, painted in faded reds and blues and greens, stretching out across the terminal like a metal city built by giants. She had been to Port Newark dozens of times over the years. Her grandfather used to bring her here when she was small, walking her through the container yards and explaining how every single box represented someone's livelihood. A farmer's harvest, a factory's quarterly output, a small business owner's entire inventory riding across the ocean on faith and a shipping contract. She had loved it then, the scale of it, the noise, the feeling that the whole world was moving through this one place. Today, she was here because Damon Vance had sent her a text at 7 in the morning that read, "Port Newark, Dock 14, 2 p.m., don't be late." No greeting, no context, just an order. She found him standing near the dock office, hands in the pockets of a long black coat, watching a crane lift a 40-foot container off a cargo ship with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be. Thor sat beside him on the pavement, massive and still, like a statue carved out of obsidian. "You could have given me more than 6 hours' notice," Avery said as she approached. Damon glanced at her. "You're here, aren't you?" "Because I don't have a choice. You made that very clear in the boardroom." "You always have a choice, Miss Hayes. You just keep making the right one." Before Avery could respond, a stocky man in a yellow safety vest came barreling around the corner of the dock office, flanked by 2 port workers who looked more like hired muscle than longshoremen. He was mid-40s, thick-necked, with a clipboard tucked under one arm and the kind of permanent scowl that suggested he had been running this particular corner of the port for years and didn't appreciate visitors. "You Vance?" the man said, stopping about 10 feet away. His eyes dropped to Thor, and he took a half-step back before catching himself. "I am," Damon said. "Name's Briggs. I manage dock operations for terminals 12 through 16. He jerked his chin toward the container ship. "Your cargo sitting in a hold queue. Customs clearance is backed up, inspection tags are pending, and nothing moves off my dock until the processing fees are settled." Avery frowned. "Processing fees? Our customs broker cleared those shipments 2 days ago. I signed the release forms myself." Briggs didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on Damon. "Things change. New fees. Port congestion surcharge, priority handling, expedited inspection. It adds up." "How much?" Damon asked. His voice hadn't changed. Still low, still calm, still carrying that same unhurried weight. Briggs shifted his stance. 40,000, cash, and your cargo clears by tonight." The number hung in the air like smoke. Avery stepped forward. "That's extortion. There's no such thing as a port congestion surcharge on pre-cleared freight. I've been managing these routes for 3 years, and I've never once—" Briggs finally turned to her with a dismissive look that made her blood boil. "Listen, sweetheart. This is between me and your boss. Why don't you go wait in the car?" Avery opened her mouth to fire back, but Damon spoke first. "Say that to her again." 3 words, spoken quietly, almost gently. Briggs turned back to Damon, and whatever he saw in those dark, steady eyes made the color drain from his face in real time. The 2 port workers behind him exchanged a glance and shifted their weight, suddenly unsure of where they wanted to be standing. Damon took 1 step forward, just 1. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't clench his fists, he didn't make any kind of theatrical gesture. He simply closed the distance by 12 inches and looked down at Briggs with an expression that was completely empty of emotion, which somehow made it worse than any display of anger could have been. "I know who you are, Briggs," Damon said. "I know you've been running a surcharge scam on independent freight operators through this terminal for the last 4 years. I know you pocket roughly $600,000 a year in cash bribes that never touch a bank account. I know the names of every dock supervisor you've cut in on the operation, and I know which ones have families they'd prefer to keep out of any federal investigation." Briggs's clipboard slipped from under his arm and clattered on the asphalt. He didn't pick it up. "Here's what's going to happen,"
Damon continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. You're going to release every Hayes Logistics container currently sitting in your hold queue. You're going to process them under standard Port Authority rates with full documentation. And then you're going to walk into that dock office, collect your personal belongings, and leave this terminal. Because as of this morning, I own the operating lease on terminals 12 through 16, and your employment here is finished. Briggs's mouth opened. Nothing came out. If you're still standing on this dock in 10 minutes, Damon said, my attorneys will begin filing federal racketeering complaints before you reach the parking lot. Do you understand? Briggs understood. He turned around without a word, shoved past his 2 associates, and disappeared into the dock office. Through the window, Avery could see him grabbing a jacket and a duffel bag from behind a desk. 3 minutes later, he was gone. The 2 port workers looked at Damon, then at each other, then quietly walked back toward the container yard as if they had suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. Avery stood very still. She had seen corporate executives handle difficult situations before. She had watched her grandfather negotiate with union leaders, government regulators, and rival shipping firms. But she had never seen anything like what just happened. Damon hadn't threatened Briggs with violence. He hadn't raised his voice or made a scene. He had simply presented facts with the cold precision of a man who had already investigated every detail, anticipated every response, and predetermined the outcome before the conversation even started. It was terrifying. And it was effective. You already owned the lease on these terminals, Avery said slowly. Before we even got here today, you knew exactly what Briggs was going to do. Damon picked up Briggs's fallen clipboard, glanced at it, and handed it to her. Now you have full access to your cargo. I believe you said the release forms were already signed. He turned and walked back toward the dock office, Thor falling into step beside him. Avery looked down at the clipboard, then back at Damon's retreating figure. Who exactly had she gotten into business with? Sunday morning was supposed to be sacred. It was the one day Avery allowed herself to step away from the spreadsheets, the freight schedules, the endless chain of emails from board members who suddenly had opinions about everything now that someone else was signing the checks. Sunday morning meant her favorite cafe in Brooklyn, a corner table by the window, a cappuccino with an extra shot, and Barnaby curled up under her chair, pretending to be well-behaved, while secretly eyeing every pastry that passed within 3 feet of his nose. The cafe was called Flower and Fern, a small artisan bakery tucked between a vintage bookshop and a laundromat on a quiet, tree-lined street in Carroll Gardens. It had exposed brick walls, mismatched wooden chairs, and a hand-painted sign on the door that read, "Dogs welcome, attitudes optional." Avery had been coming here every Sunday since college. The owner, a retired pastry chef named Gloria, knew her order by heart and always slipped Barnaby a piece of plain croissant when she thought Avery wasn't looking. Avery pushed open the door at 8:30, Barnaby trotting ahead of her on his leash with the confidence of a dog who believed the entire neighborhood had been built for his personal enjoyment. And then he stopped. His ears went flat, his tiny body went rigid, and a low, rumbling growl started building in his chest like a miniature engine warming up for a fight. Avery followed his gaze to the outdoor patio. Damon Vance was sitting at the corner table. Her corner table. He was wearing a simple black crew-neck sweater and dark jeans, which was the most casual she had ever seen him, and somehow he still looked like someone who could buy the entire block without checking his bank balance first. A cup of black coffee sat in front of him, untouched, steam curling up into the cool morning air. Thor was lying at his feet, enormous head resting on his front paws, looking perfectly content. Barnaby launched into a full, barking assault. Thor lifted his head, looked at Barnaby, blinked once, and put his head back down. "You have got to be kidding me," Avery muttered. Damon looked up from his phone. When he saw her, something shifted in his expression, a slight easing of the hard lines around his jaw,
as if the sight of a furious 6-pound Yorkie trying to intimidate his Rottweiler was the most entertaining thing that had happened to him all week. "Ms. Hayes," he said, "are you following me?" "I've been coming to this cafe for 2 years." Avery narrowed her eyes. "I've been coming here for 8. I've never seen you once." "I usually come earlier, 6:30. He glanced at Barnaby, who was still barking with heroic determination. "Your dog remembers me." "My dog remembers everyone he doesn't like. It's a long list." Damon reached into the pocket of his jacket, which was draped over the back of his chair, and pulled out a small brown dog treat. He held it out toward Barnaby, low and steady, without leaning forward or making any sudden movement. Barnaby stopped barking. His nose twitched. The growling faded into a suspicious silence. He took one cautious step forward, then another, then snatched the treat from Damon's fingers and retreated under Avery's legs to eat it in private. Avery stared. "He doesn't take food from strangers. Ever. Gloria's been trying to hand-feed him for 3 years, and he still makes her put it on the floor first." "Dogs understand intent," Damon said. "He knows I'm not a threat." "Do you carry dog treats everywhere you go?" "Thor gets them after walks. I keep a few extra." There was a pause. Avery realized she was still standing in the patio doorway, holding Barnaby's leash, with no real reason to keep hovering. Every table inside the cafe was taken. The only open seat on the patio was across from Damon. He seemed to read the calculation on her face. "Sit down, Miss Hayes. It's Sunday. I'm not here to talk about freight contracts." Against every instinct that told her to maintain professional distance from the man who had taken over her company 4 days ago, Avery pulled out the chair and sat down. Gloria appeared almost instantly with her usual cappuccino, gave Damon a familiar nod, and disappeared back inside. "Gloria knows you," Avery said, surprised. "I told you, 2 years." Avery wrapped her hands around her cup and studied him. Without the boardroom, without the attorneys, without the armored SUV and the dock workers and the corporate machinery, Damon Vance looked almost ordinary. Almost. There was still that quiet gravity about him, that sense that even sitting in a Brooklyn cafe on a Sunday morning, he was aware of everything happening within a 2-block radius. "Can I ask you something?" Avery said. Damon lifted his coffee. "You're going to ask regardless." "Why Hayes Logistics? You could have bought a dozen companies in better financial shape, companies that wouldn't require a full restructuring and a fight with a stubborn VP who yells at you about your dog. Why us?" Damon set his cup down and looked at her for a long moment. The morning light caught his eyes at an angle, and for the first time Avery noticed they weren't pure black. They were a very dark brown, almost amber at the edges, like coffee held up to the sun. 19 years ago, Damon said, my father was trying to establish a legitimate shipping contract through the eastern seaboard. Every logistics firm he approached turned him away. They knew the Vance name. They knew what it carried. Nobody wanted the association. Avery's hands tightened around her cup. "Your grandfather was the only one who took the meeting," Damon continued. "He sat across from my father in a diner in Newark, looked at the shipping manifest and said, 'I don't care who you are outside this room. If your cargo is legal and your money clears, you've got a contract.' He shook my father's hand and honored that deal for 6 years without ever asking a single question about our family." Avery's throat felt tight. That sounded exactly like something her grandfather would do. He had always judged people by their word and their handshake, never by their reputation. "Your grandfather gave my father something no one else in this city would," Damon said quietly. "Respect. And I don't forget debts like that." Avery looked down at her cappuccino. The foam was settling into a lopsided heart shape, which felt absurdly appropriate for a moment she hadn't expected to feel this deeply. "So you bought a failing logistics company to repay a 19-year-old favor," she said. "I bought a good company run by a capable woman who needed capital, not charity." He paused. "The favor is just why I was paying attention." Under the table, Barnaby finished his treat and cautiously crept toward Thor. The Rottweiler opened one eye, watched the Yorkie sniff his front paw, and closed it again. Avery took a long sip of her coffee. For the record, I still think your dog is too big for a public sidewalk. The corner of Damon's mouth lifted. It was barely a movement, a fraction of a degree, and it disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. But Avery saw it, and for the first time since she had met Damon Vance, she thought maybe, just maybe, there was something human underneath all that ice. The freight warehouse in Queens was not the kind of place anyone wanted to be at 11 o'clock at night. It sat at the end of a dead-end industrial road in Maspeth, surrounded by chain-link fencing and empty lots filled with rusted shipping containers that hadn't moved in years. The building itself was massive, 120,000 square feet of corrugated steel and concrete floors, filled with palletized cargo stacked on industrial shelving that reached 30 feet high. During the day, it hummed with forklifts and dock workers and the constant beeping of reversing trucks. At night, it was a hollow cathedral of shadows and silence, lit by buzzing fluorescent panels that cast everything in a flat, greenish light. Avery had been here since 7, sitting cross-legged on a folding chair in the warehouse manager's office with her laptop balanced on a stack of inventory binders. She was running a full audit of the distribution center's stock records, cross-referencing physical counts against the digital manifests to identify discrepancies that had been piling up for months under the previous management. It was tedious, unglamorous work, the kind of thing that no one in the boardroom ever wanted to think about, but that could sink an entire logistics operation if left unchecked. She was halfway through the third spreadsheet when her phone buzzed, a text from Damon. "Are you still at the Queens facility?" She typed back, "Yes, finishing the inventory reconciliation. Why?" 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Then the message came through. "Stay in the office. Lock the door. I'm 15 minutes out." Avery read the message twice. The tone was different from his usual clipped, business-like texts. There was an urgency buried in those short sentences that made something cold settle in the pit of her stomach. She stood up and walked to the office window that overlooked the main warehouse floor. Everything looked normal. Rows and rows of palletized freight, the distant hum of the building's ventilation system, the occasional tick of metal expanding and contracting in the cool night air. Then she heard it. A door. Somewhere on the far side of the warehouse, near the loading bay, the heavy metallic groan of a rolling dock door being forced open from the outside. Avery's hand went to her phone. She almost dialed 911, then stopped. Something told her to wait. Something about the certainty in Damon's text, the way he hadn't said, "Call the police" or "Get out of the building." He had said, "Stay," and "Lock the door," as if he already knew exactly what was happening and had already decided how it was going to end. She locked the office door and turned off the light. From the darkened window, she could see 3 figures moving through the warehouse floor. They were dressed in dark clothing, moving quickly between the rows of shelving, pulling tarps off pallets and checking labels. One of them was carrying a crowbar. Another had a can of something, paint maybe, or accelerant, and was splashing it across a row of cardboard shipping boxes stacked near the south wall. They were going to torch the inventory. Avery's pulse was hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. She pressed herself against the wall beside the window and watched, barely breathing. Headlights swept across the loading bay. 2 black SUVs pulled into the dock area in complete silence, their engines barely audible. The doors opened, and 5 men stepped out, each one moving with the kind of coordinated discipline that spoke of training and experience. They fanned out across the loading bay entrance, cutting off every exit route with practiced efficiency. And then Damon walked through the dock door. He was wearing the same long black coat from the port, hands in his pockets, his stride unhurried despite the situation. Thor walked beside him, ears forward, every muscle in the Rottweiler's body coiled with a focused alertness that made the animal look twice his already enormous size. The 3 intruders froze. Damon stopped about 20 feet from them, positioned between 2 towering rows of freight shelving. He didn't shout. He didn't pull out a weapon. He simply stood there, hands still in his pockets, and let the silence do the work. The man with the crowbar was the first to speak.
This isn't your territory, Vance. Meridian Crew runs Queen's distribution. Has for years.
Meridian Crew ran Queen's distribution, Damon corrected, his voice echoing calmly through the open warehouse. Past tense. Every asset in this building is registered under Hayes Logistics, which is now a Vance Syndicate holding. You're standing in my warehouse, holding a crowbar near my cargo, and your friend over there just poured what smells like paint thinner on $50,000 worth of medical supply shipments. The man with the can lowered it slowly.
So here's what happens next, Damon continued.
You put down everything you're carrying, you walk out through that dock door, and you go back to whoever sent you and deliver a message. Hayes Logistics is under full Vance protection. Every truck, every warehouse, every shipping container. Anyone who touches this operation answers to me personally. And I promise you, that is a conversation nobody wants to have twice. There was a long, stretched silence. The man with the crowbar looked at his two associates. One of them was already backing toward the door. The other set the paint thinner can on the ground with exaggerated care, as if it might explode if he moved too quickly. The crowbar clattered to the concrete floor. All three men walked out through the loading bay without looking back. Damon watched them go. Then he turned to one of his men and spoke a few quiet words that Avery couldn't hear from behind the office window. Two of the SUV team moved to secure the dock doors. Another began checking the pallets for damage. 5 minutes later, there was a knock on the office door. "Miss Hayes, it's clear." Avery unlocked the door. Damon was standing in the hallway, his expression as composed as if he had just returned from picking up dry cleaning. "What was that?" Avery asked. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking, and she pressed them flat against her thighs to hide it. "A misunderstanding," Damon said. "It's been resolved." "A misunderstanding? 3 men just tried to burn down our inventory." Damon's eyes met hers, and for the briefest moment, she saw something behind the calm, a quiet, simmering intensity that told her he had taken this intrusion extremely personally, that whoever had sent those men had made a mistake they would deeply regret. "Your inventory is intact," he said. "Your facility is secure. My team will have a permanent presence here starting tomorrow morning." He paused. "Are you all right?" The question caught her off guard. It was the first time he had asked her anything personal, the first time his voice had carried something softer than authority in. "I'm fine," she said. Damon studied her face for a moment, as if verifying the answer for himself, then nodded. "I'll have someone drive you home. Finish the audit tomorrow." He turned and walked back toward the loading bay, Thor padding silently beside him. Avery leaned against the office door frame and watched him go. Her hands were still trembling. The warehouse smelled faintly of paint thinner and cold metal. She had just watched Damon Vance command a room full of dangerous men with nothing but his voice and his presence. He had kept her safe without putting her in the middle of whatever world he operated in. He had shown up in 15 minutes, handled the situation completely, and asked if she was all right before asking about the cargo. She didn't know what to do with that. The Metropolitan Club was the kind of place that reminded you exactly where you stood in the world. Built in the 1890s by people who had more money than most countries, it sat on the corner of 5th Avenue and 60th Street like a marble fortress designed to keep ordinary life at a comfortable distance. The ceilings were 40 feet high. The chandeliers weighed more than Avery's car. Every surface was either gilded, carved, or polished to a mirror finish, and the air smelled like aged oak, expensive perfume, and the quiet arrogance of generational wealth. Avery adjusted the strap of her midnight blue gown in the elevator mirror and tried to remember why she had agreed to this. The event was a corporate charity gala, one of those carefully staged affairs where Manhattan's wealthiest executives wrote large checks to carefully selected causes while networking with each other over champagne that cost more per glass than most people's monthly grocery bills.
Damon had insisted she attend as the public face of Hayes Logistics for the evening. The merger announcement was scheduled for the end of the night, and her presence was, in his words, essential to the narrative. She had wanted to argue. She had wanted to say that she was an operations executive, not a spokesperson, and that she would rather spend the evening reconciling shipping manifests than making small talk with people who had never loaded a cargo container in their lives. But Damon had already sent the dress. It arrived at her apartment that afternoon in a matte black garment bag with no label, no note, and no receipt. Just a perfectly fitted midnight blue gown with a subtle silver thread running through the fabric that caught the light when she moved. She had almost sent it back on principle. Almost. The elevator doors opened, and Avery stepped into the grand ballroom. The room was already full. 200 of Manhattan's corporate elite were arranged in clusters around cocktail tables and seated along the edges of a polished dance floor that nobody would actually use. Waiters moved through the crowd with silver trays. A string quartet played something classical in the far corner. And at the center of it all, standing near the bar with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, was Damon. He saw her the moment she entered. His gaze traveled from her face to the gown and back again, without any visible reaction. But there was something in the way he held the look for an extra beat that told Avery the dress had accomplished exactly what it was designed to accomplish. She crossed the room and stood beside him. The dress was unnecessary. And yet it fits perfectly. That's not the point. It's exactly the point. He handed her a glass of champagne from a passing tray. You're representing a multi-million-dollar company tonight. First impressions carry weight in rooms like this. Avery took the glass and surveyed the crowd. She recognized several faces: CEOs, hedge fund managers, board chairs from competing logistics firms. Many of them had known her grandfather. Many of them had attended his funeral and promised to look after his legacy, and then done absolutely nothing when Hayes Logistics started bleeding money. The first hour passed smoothly enough. Avery made her rounds, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, answering carefully worded questions about the restructuring with the practiced composure of someone who had grown up in boardrooms. Damon stayed close but kept his distance, a constant presence at the edge of her peripheral vision, speaking quietly with a rotating cast of executives who all seemed slightly uncomfortable in his company. The trouble started near the dessert table. Avery was reaching for a miniature lemon tart when a voice behind her said, loud enough for the surrounding cluster of guests to hear, "So this is the Hayes girl who sold her grandfather's company to the highest bidder." Avery turned. The speaker was Randall Prescott, CEO of Prescott Maritime, a rival shipping firm that had been trying to absorb Hayes Logistics for years. He was in his mid-50s, silver-haired, deeply tanned from a lifestyle that involved more yacht decks than office desks, and he had the particular brand of confidence that came from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. Standing with him were two other executives Avery recognized: Lawrence Cho from Pacific Freight International and Diana Merritt from Sterling Transport Group. All three of them were smiling the kind of smile that had nothing to do with warmth. "I didn't sell anything, Randall," Avery said evenly. "Hayes Logistics underwent a capital restructuring with a majority investor. The operational leadership remains unchanged." "Operational leadership," Prescott repeated, swirling his scotch. "Is that what they're calling it now? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a 26-year-old girl who couldn't keep the lights on handed the keys to some corporate raider nobody had heard of 6 months ago." He glanced at Cho and Merritt for confirmation. They both nodded on cue. "Your grandfather must be turning in his grave." The words landed like a slap. Avery's fingers tightened around her champagne glass. She had prepared herself for skepticism, for pointed questions, even for condescension. She had not prepared herself for someone invoking her grandfather's memory as a weapon in front of 50 people. Before she could respond, a hand settled on the small of her back. Damon appeared beside her, as if he had materialized from the floor itself.
His expression was perfectly neutral, which by now, Avery had learned was his most dangerous setting. Randall Prescott, Damon said. Prescott Maritime, founded 1987. Current market valuation, $412 million. Outstanding debt obligations, $189 million, most of it leveraged against fleet assets that are averaging 22 years past their recommended service life. He paused. Your company is a floating museum held together by insurance fraud and deferred maintenance. I wouldn't throw stones from a glass yacht. Prescott's smile vanished. Damon turned to Lawrence Cho. Pacific Freight, 16 pending OSHA violations across your West Coast terminals, 2 wrongful termination suits in discovery. Shall I continue? Cho said nothing. Damon's gaze moved to Diana Merritt, who suddenly found the bottom of her wine glass very interesting. Ms. Hayes didn't hand anyone the keys to her company, Damon said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the surrounding guests without ever rising above a conversational tone. She fought for it when every person in this room, including the 3 of you, watched it struggle and did nothing. She is the reason Hayes Logistics still exists, and she is the reason it is going to become the most dominant freight operation on the eastern seaboard within the next 18 months. Anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to bring it up with me directly. The silence around the dessert table was absolute. Prescott cleared his throat, mumbled something about needing to find his wife, and walked away. Cho and Merritt followed without a word. Avery stood very still, her champagne untouched, her heart beating in a strange rhythm she couldn't quite identify. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did." She looked up at him. He was already looking at her, and for the first time, the wall behind his eyes seemed thinner. There was something there, a warmth he kept buried so deep it barely reached the surface, like heat radiating from underground. "Thank you," she said. Damon picked up her abandoned lemon tart from the dessert table and placed it on a napkin in front of her. "You were reaching for this." Avery laughed. It was a small, surprised sound, and it seemed to catch both of them off guard. Somewhere across the ballroom, the string quartet shifted into something slower. The chandeliers cast golden light across the marble floors, and Avery realized, standing beside the most feared man in the room, that she felt safer than she had in months. The penthouse office occupied the entire top floor of a building on West 57th Street that didn't have a name on the lobby directory. Avery had been given the address by Damon's assistant, a quiet, efficient man named Collier, who communicated exclusively through brief emails and never used exclamation marks. The message had been simple. Mr. Vance requires the updated clearance documents for the Eastern Seaboard shipping corridor by tonight. His office address is below. Security will be expecting you. It was 11:40 when Avery stepped out of the private elevator, a leather folder tucked under her arm containing the revised customs authorization forms that Damon needed signed before the Port Authority's Monday morning deadline. She had spent the entire evening preparing them, triple-checking every line item, every routing code, every signature block. Because she had learned over the past 12 days that Damon Vance did not tolerate errors, and she refused to give him a reason to find one. The elevator opened directly into a wide reception area with dark hardwood floors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, and the kind of sparse, deliberate furniture arrangement that suggested everything in the room cost a fortune and had been chosen by someone who valued function over display. A single desk lamp cast a warm circle of light near the entrance. The rest of the space faded into shadow. "Mr. Vance?" Avery called out. Silence. She checked her phone. No messages. Collier had confirmed the drop-off time an hour ago. Damon was supposed to be here. Avery walked deeper into the office, her heels clicking on the hardwood. The reception area opened into a larger room that served as Damon's private workspace. A broad mahogany desk positioned in front of the western windows, 2 leather chairs angled toward it, and a series of built-in shelves along the far wall filled with bound ledgers, legal volumes, and several framed photographs she couldn't make out in the low light. She set the leather folder on the corner of his desk and turned to leave. That was when she noticed the filing cabinet. It was standing open. The top drawer was pulled out about 6 inches, and inside, a stack of documents was arranged in neat, color-coded folders. Under normal circumstances, Avery would have walked past without a second thought. She was not the kind of person who went through other people's things. But the folder on top was stamped with a logo she recognized, the Hayes Logistics routing seal, the same compass and anchor mark her grandfather had designed 40 years ago. She stopped. Her hand moved before her better judgment could intervene. She pulled the folder out and opened it. Inside were shipping manifests, dozens of them, dating back over a year, each one documenting freight movements through ports and rail terminals across the northeastern United States. The routes were familiar: Newark, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston, all standard Hayes Logistics corridors that Avery had managed herself. But the authorization codes were wrong. Each manifest carried a secondary routing stamp she had never seen before, a small, angular crest, 2 interlocking V's pressed into the corner of every page in dark ink. Below the crest, the manifests listed cargo categories that didn't match any Hayes Logistics inventory she had ever handled. The descriptions were vague: private freight, consolidated assets, priority sealed transport. No specific contents listed, no weight declarations, no customs verification numbers. Avery's mouth went dry. She pulled another folder from the drawer. Same crest, same vague cargo descriptions, same secondary routing codes layered beneath the legitimate Hayes Logistics documentation. She pulled a third folder and found correspondence, internal memos between Damon and individuals identified only by initials, discussing supply chain timelines, territory boundaries, and distribution agreements that read nothing like any corporate contract she had ever encountered. The 2 interlocking V's. Vance. The crest wasn't a corporate logo, it was a syndicate mark. Avery's hands were trembling. She flipped through the pages faster now, her eyes scanning for anything that would contradict the conclusion forming in her mind, anything that would let her believe this was just an unusual but legal business arrangement. She found a map instead. It was folded inside the last folder, a detailed chart of the entire eastern seaboard, marked with color-coded routes that mirrored Hayes Logistics shipping lanes almost exactly. Alongside each route, handwritten notes in what she recognized as Damon's sharp, angular handwriting detailed transfer points, security rotations, and delivery windows. This was a private underground distribution network, carefully designed to operate in the shadows of legitimate freight infrastructure. Her company's infrastructure. Avery closed the folder and pressed it against her chest, breathing hard. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. The way Damon had handled Briggs at the port with encyclopedic knowledge of every corrupt operation on the docks. The way his men had appeared at the Queen's warehouse with military coordination, already knowing exactly who the intruders were and who had sent them. The way every corporate rival in the city seemed to flinch at the mention of his name.
Damon Vance was not a corporate investor who happened to have powerful connections. He was the connection, the center of it, the man who controlled the city's underground supply lines, and he had built his network along the exact same routes her grandfather had spent a lifetime creating. The leather folder she had brought slipped from the corner of the desk and hit the floor with a sharp slap that echoed through the empty office like a gunshot. Avery flinched. Behind her, a door opened. "Working late, Ms. Hayes?" Damon's voice came from the hallway entrance. He stepped into the office in a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, a towel draped over one shoulder as if he had just come from a private gym somewhere in the building. His dark hair was slightly damp. His expression was calm, measured, completely unreadable. His eyes moved from Avery's face to the open filing cabinet, then to the folder pressed against her chest, then back to her face. The air between them changed. It thickened, compressed, became something heavy and fragile at the same time, like glass bending under pressure. "I can explain what you're looking at," Damon said quietly. "Can you?" Avery's voice came out steadier than she expected, which surprised them both. "Because what I'm looking at is a private distribution network running through my company's shipping corridors. What I'm looking at is cargo manifests with no declared contents being routed through ports that I manage. What I'm looking at, Damon, is evidence that the man who bought my family's company is running an underground empire through it." She used his first name without thinking. It landed in the room like a dropped coin, small and sharp and impossible to ignore. Damon didn't move. He stood in the doorway, 10 feet away, his hands at his sides, watching her with an expression that was no longer unreadable. There was something beneath it now, something that looked almost like resignation, as if he had always known this moment would come and had simply been waiting for it to arrive. "You should sit down," he said. "I don't want to sit down. I want the truth." Damon looked at her for a long, weighted moment. Then he walked past her to the open filing cabinet and slowly pushed the drawer closed. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Rooftop, 7 a.m. I'll give you everything." Avery didn't sleep. She lay in her apartment in Park Slope with the lights on, staring at the ceiling, running through every interaction she'd had with Damon Vance since that first morning at Teterboro. Every conversation, every glance, every carefully chosen word. She replayed them all, turning them over like stones, looking for the cracks she had missed. The signs had been there from the beginning. The way Briggs at the port had recognized the Vance name and crumbled instantly. The way the sabotage crew at the Queen's warehouse had backed down the moment Damon appeared, as if his presence alone carried the authority of an army. The way corporate rivals at the gala had flinched when he spoke, not because he was wealthy, but because they were afraid. She had seen all of it. She had simply chosen not to look too closely, because looking closely meant asking questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. At 6:15, she got dressed, clipped Barnaby's leash to his collar out of habit, even though she wasn't taking him for a walk, then unclipped it and set him on his bed with a treat. She couldn't bring him where she was going. This wasn't a Sunday morning cafe conversation. She arrived at the building on West 57th Street at 6:50. The same private elevator, the same silent ride to the top floor. But this time, instead of stepping into the penthouse office, she followed a narrow corridor to a steel door marked Roof Access, authorized personnel only. It was already propped open. The rooftop helipad was a wide concrete platform surrounded by a low safety railing, positioned on the northwest corner of the building, with an unobstructed view of the Hudson River and the New Jersey skyline beyond it. A single helicopter sat on the landing pad, its rotors still, its dark blue fuselage gleaming in the early morning light. The wind at this height was sharp and constant, pulling at Avery's hair and pressing her coat flat against her body. Damon was standing near the railing, facing west, his hands resting on the metal bar. He was wearing a dark suit again, perfectly composed, as if the conversation they were about to have was just another item on his morning schedule. Thor was nowhere in sight. He had come alone. Avery walked across the helipad until she was standing 6 feet from him, close enough to speak without shouting over the wind, far enough to maintain the distance she needed. "I'm here," she said. "Talk." Damon turned to face her. In the gray morning light, the hard angles of his face looked sharper than usual, and the dark circles under his eyes told Avery that he hadn't slept either. "Everything you saw in those files is real," he said. "The Vance Syndicate controls the largest private distribution network on the eastern seaboard. We move freight through channels that don't appear on any government registry. We operate in the spaces between legitimate commerce and the underground economy, and we have done so for over 30 years. The wind filled the silence between his sentences. "My father built the network.
I inherited it when he stepped down 4 years ago. I run it the same way he did, with discipline, with structure, and with one absolute rule. He paused. We do not touch legitimate businesses. We do not contaminate clean operations with underground freight. And we do not use honest people as cover.
Avery folded her arms. Then explain the manifests. Explain why your syndicate crest is stamped on shipping documents that run through my company's corridors.
Because the corridors overlap, Damon said. The routes your grandfather built were the most efficient freight pathways on the coast. My father recognized that 30 years ago, which is why he approached your grandfather in the first place. The Vance network runs parallel to Hayes Logistics, using the same geographic corridors, the same port access points, the same rail connections, but the cargo never intersects. Your company's shipments have never carried a single ounce of syndicate freight. Every container, every manifest, every customs declaration tied to Hayes Logistics is legitimate. I made sure of that personally.
You made sure of it, Avery repeated. Personally?
Yes.
And I'm supposed to just take your word for that?
Damon reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded document. He held it out to her. This is a full independent audit of every Hayes Logistics shipment processed in the last 18 months. Every container tracked, every customs record verified, every port inspection logged. I commissioned it from a third-party forensic accounting firm before the acquisition was finalized. Their conclusion is on the last page. Avery took the document and flipped to the back. The summary was 3 lines long. No evidence of unauthorized freight. No evidence of undeclared cargo. No evidence of regulatory violations at any level. She looked up.
You had this ready?
I had it ready because I knew you would eventually find those files, and I knew that when you did, you would demand proof, and you would accept nothing less than independent verification. He held her gaze. I know who you are, Avery. You don't take anything on faith. That's why I prepared for this. There it was again, her first name. He had used it deliberately, just as she had used his the night before. The professional formality was gone, stripped away by 12 days of tension and proximity, and a truth that had been building between them since the first morning at the airport.
Why didn't you tell me from the beginning? Avery asked. Why let me find out by accident in your office at midnight instead of being honest from the start?
Damon was quiet for a moment. The wind pulled at his jacket and pressed his shirt flat against his chest. Because I didn't want you to look at me the way you're looking at me right now. The honesty of it hit her harder than anything in the files had. Avery turned away and walked to the railing. She gripped the cold metal and stared out at the river, watching a cargo ship move slowly toward Newark Bay. She could see the cranes at Port Newark from here, tiny and distant, loading containers onto vessels that would carry them across the world. Her grandfather's world. Her world.
If I walk away right now, she said, without turning around, what happens?
I transfer the full controlling stake back to you. 53%, free and clear. No strings, no conditions, no debt. Hayes Logistics becomes yours entirely, and the Vance Syndicate steps away permanently.
You'd give up a multi-million-dollar investment, just like that?
I didn't buy your company for the investment, Avery. I told you why I bought it. That reason hasn't changed. She turned back to face him. He was standing exactly where she had left him, hands at his sides, making no effort to close the distance between them. He wasn't persuading her. He wasn't pressuring her. He was standing still and letting her decide, with the full understanding that she might choose to walk away and never come back. That was what got her. In every boardroom she had ever sat in, powerful men had tried to corner her, to outmaneuver her, to use leverage and position to bend her decisions toward their own interests. Damon had enough leverage to bury her. He had enough power to make walking away impossible. And instead, he was offering her the door.
I need time, she said.
Damon nodded once. "Take whatever you need." Avery walked past him toward the rooftop door. She paused with her hand on the steel frame and looked back. He was standing at the railing now, facing the river, his profile sharp against the brightening sky. "For what it's worth," she said, "I believe the audit." She went through the door and let it close behind her. The elevator ride down felt longer than the one going up. Avery leaned against the wall and pressed the folded audit report against her chest, the same way she had pressed the syndicate files the night before. 2 documents, 2 truths, both real. The question wasn't whether she believed him. The question was whether she was willing to stand beside a man whose world operated in the shadows, knowing that his shadow had been protecting her family's legacy long before she ever knew he existed. The rail terminal sat 40 miles west of Philadelphia, carved into a flat stretch of industrial land where Pennsylvania's rolling green countryside gave way to concrete and steel. Avery had driven out alone. That was the first mistake, though she didn't know it yet.
The terminal was one of Hayes Logistics' most critical inland hubs, a junction point where freight arriving by rail from the Midwest was sorted, redistributed, and loaded onto trucks for final delivery to ports along the eastern seaboard. Her grandfather had negotiated the original lease on this facility 22 years ago, and it remained one of the company's most valuable assets, processing over 300 containers per week during peak season. The inspection had been on the calendar for days, a routine review of track conditions, loading equipment, and security infrastructure, the kind of operational check that Avery had done 100 times before at facilities exactly like this one. She had emailed Damon's office about the trip as a courtesy. She had not asked for permission. She had not asked for company. 2 days had passed since the rooftop conversation, and Avery had spent them in a careful, deliberate silence. She went to work. She attended meetings. She answered Damon's emails with professional precision and said nothing about the files, the audit, or the offer he had made to walk away. She needed space to think, and Damon, to his credit, had given it to her without a single follow-up. She arrived at the terminal at 4 in the afternoon, parked near the main operations building, and spent 2 hours walking the facility with the site manager, a retired Army logistics officer named Greer, who ran the terminal with military efficiency and genuine pride. Everything checked out. Track conditions were solid. Loading cranes were serviced and certified. Security cameras covered every angle of the yard. It was dusk when Avery walked back to her car. The sun was dropping behind the tree line to the west, painting the sky in shades of copper and violet, and the air had that particular autumn chill that made every sound carry farther than it should. The yard was quieting down for the evening. Most of the day crew had clocked out. A few floodlights hummed to life along the perimeter fence. Avery was reaching for her car door when she heard the trucks. 3 of them, heavy commercial vehicles with blacked-out windows, came rolling through the terminal's east gate in a tight convoy. They weren't Hayes Logistics trucks. They carried no company markings, no DOT numbers, no identification of any kind. They fanned out across the yard and stopped in a semicircle near the main loading platform, blocking the primary access road. Doors opened. 8 men stepped out. They weren't dressed like dock workers or truck drivers. They wore tactical clothing, dark jackets, heavy boots, the kind of coordinated appearance that suggested organization and purpose. 2 of them moved immediately toward the loading platform, where a Hayes Logistics railcar was sitting, loaded and sealed for a morning departure. The others spread out across the yard, positioning themselves at key access points with the practiced ease of people who had studied the facility's layout in advance. Avery's hand froze on her car door handle. A man she didn't recognize stepped forward from the lead truck. He was tall, narrow-faced, with close-cropped gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to giving orders. He looked around the yard with a proprietary calm, as if he was surveying property he already owned.
"Ms. Hayes," he called out, his voice carrying across the gravel. "My name is Declan Marsh. I represent certain business interests that have a disagreement with your new partner. We're here to collect what we're owed." Avery's mouth went dry.
This is a private facility. You're trespassing.
We won't be long. My men are going to open that rail car and remove its contents. You're welcome to file whatever complaint you'd like after we're gone, but I'd recommend staying by your vehicle and keeping quiet. This doesn't concern you." Avery's phone was in her hand before Marsh finished his sentence. She had already pulled up Damon's number. She didn't call. She sent a single text, the terminal's address, and one word: "Now." Marsh noticed the phone and smiled. "If you're calling the police, the nearest station is 35 minutes away. If you're calling Vance, well," he shrugged, "I'm counting on it." The next 7 minutes felt like an hour.
Marsh's men produced bolt cutters and began working on the rail car's security seals. Avery stood by her car, one hand gripping her phone, the other pressed flat against the hood to keep it from shaking. She kept her eyes on Marsh, who had lit a cigarette and was leaning against his truck with the patience of a man who believed he had already won. Then Thor started barking. The sound came from somewhere beyond the perimeter fence, deep, thunderous, reverberating across the yard like a warning siren. Marsh's cigarette stopped halfway to his mouth. Headlights exploded through the west gate. 4 black SUVs tore into the terminal in a diamond formation, kicking up gravel and dust. They screeched to a halt across the yard, cutting off every exit route Marsh's trucks could reach. Doors flew open, and 12 men stepped out, each one positioned with the kind of tactical precision that made Marsh's crew look like amateurs playing dress-up. Damon walked through the settling dust.
He moved slowly, deliberately, his long coat catching the floodlight as Thor fell into step beside him. The Rottweiler's bark had dropped into a low, continuous growl that vibrated through the ground itself. Marsh straightened up. "Vance, took you long enough." "You wanted my attention, Declan." Damon stopped 15 feet away. "You have it. Your expansion into Hayes logistics infrastructure cut through 3 of my distribution channels. I want compensation. 2 million, and the Baltimore corridor returned to my operation." Damon was quiet for a moment. He looked at Marsh the way a chess player looks at an opponent who has just made a losing move and doesn't realize it yet. "You brought 8 men to seize cargo from a facility I own," Damon said evenly. "You threatened a woman under my protection, and you blocked a rail shipment containing medical equipment bound for 4 civilian hospitals across Pennsylvania." He paused. "Do you want to rethink your position, or should I make the decision for you?" Marsh's confidence flickered. "Medical equipment?" 42 pallets of surgical instruments, dialysis machines, and pediatric care supplies, donated freight, charity cargo that Ms. Hayes personally coordinated with 3 hospital networks. Damon tilted his head. "So, when the news breaks that Declan Marsh tried to hijack medical supplies meant for hospitals, how do you think that plays for your reputation? Among your own people? Among mine?" The color drained from Marsh's face. "Here's what happens now," Damon continued. "Your men put down the bolt cutters, your trucks leave this facility in the next 60 seconds, and you go back to whatever corner of the coast you're still operating in, and you stay there. Because if I see your name attached to anything within 100 miles of a Hayes Logistics asset again, I will dismantle your entire operation piece by piece, and I will do it so quietly that you won't even realize it's gone until there's nothing left." Marsh looked at his men. They were already moving back toward the trucks, reading the situation faster than their boss. The bolt cutters lay abandoned on the gravel beside the rail car. One by one, the 3 trucks started their engines. Marsh held Damon's gaze for a long, tense moment. Then he dropped his cigarette, crushed it under his boot, and climbed into his truck without another word. 60 seconds later, the yard was empty. Damon turned to Avery. She was still standing by her car, her phone clutched in her hand, the text thread with his number still open on the screen. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she swallowed. "You got here in 7 minutes. This terminal is at least 40 minutes from Manhattan." "I wasn't in Manhattan. I was already on my way when you sent the text." Avery frowned. "How did you know?" "Because I knew Marsh was going to move this week.
I just didn't know which facility he would target. His jaw tightened. I should have had a team here before you arrived. That's on me. Avery looked out at the rail car sitting untouched on the track, its security seals still half cut, the charity cargo inside still safe. She looked at the 12 men now quietly securing the perimeter. She looked at Thor, who had stopped growling and was sitting calmly at Damon's feet. And then she looked at Damon, standing in the flood-lit gravel of a Pennsylvania rail yard, having just dismantled a rival's ambush, using nothing but logistics knowledge and the sheer force of his authority. "The medical cargo," she said quietly. "You knew what was in that rail car. You knew he wouldn't touch it once he understood what it was." "I know what's in every rail car on this network, Avery. That's my job." He looked at her. "And protecting the people who run it. That's my job too." Avery put her phone in her pocket and took a breath that she felt all the way to the bottom of her lungs. "I don't need more time," she said. "I know what I want to do." The Hoboken waterfront at sunset looked like someone had spilled gold paint across the Hudson River. Avery arrived first. She parked on Sinatra Drive and walked Barnaby along the promenade, letting the Yorkie investigate every bench, lamppost, and suspicious pigeon with his usual thoroughness. The evening was cool, the kind of mid-October weather where the air tasted clean and the city across the river looked softer than it had any right to, its jagged skyline blurred by the warm amber light of a fading sun. She had chosen this spot. When Damon had asked her where she wanted to meet, she had almost said the office, or the cafe in Brooklyn, or even the rooftop. But none of those felt right. The office was too formal, the cafe was too casual, the rooftop carried too much weight from their last conversation there. She wanted somewhere open, somewhere neutral, somewhere that didn't belong to either of them. The Hoboken Riverwalk was her grandfather's favorite place in the world. He used to drive across from Manhattan on Sunday evenings, park near the ferry terminal, and walk the entire length of the promenade with a cup of coffee and a cigar he wasn't supposed to be smoking. He said the best view of New York was from the outside looking in, because it reminded you that the city was just a place, and places only mattered because of the people in them. Avery heard Thor before she saw him. The Rottweiler's heavy footsteps on the paved walkway had a rhythm she recognized by now, steady, patient, perfectly matched to his owner's stride. She turned and saw Damon approaching from the south end of the promenade, Thor on his short leather lead, both of them silhouetted against the river light. Damon was dressed down again, dark jacket, no tie, his collar open. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen before, the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix, the kind that came from carrying weight that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. Barnaby spotted Thor and did something unexpected. He didn't bark. The Yorkie pulled forward on his leash, trotted up to the Rottweiler with his tail at a cautious half-wag, and sniffed Thor's front paw. Thor lowered his massive head and touched his nose to Barnaby's ear. The two dogs stood there for a moment in a quiet, unremarkable truce, and then Barnaby turned around and walked back to Avery's side, as if the whole thing had been his idea. "Looks like someone made a decision," Damon said, watching the dogs. "He's not the only one." They walked together along the promenade without speaking for a while. The river lapped gently against the sea wall. A jogger passed them, going the opposite direction. The world around them was ordinary and unhurried, and after 17 days of boardrooms and warehouses and helicopter pads and midnight confrontations, the ordinariness of it felt like a luxury. Damon was the one who broke the silence. "I had my attorneys prepare something." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded legal document. It was several pages thick, bound with a small black clip. He held it out to Avery. She took it and unfolded it under the light of a promenade lamppost. The header read, "Transfer of Equity, Hayes Logistics, Inc." Below it, in precise legal language, the document outlined a complete transfer of 51% of Hayes Logistics stock from Damon Vance's personal holdings to Avery Hayes, effective immediately upon signature. The terms were unconditional, no repayment schedule, no performance clauses, no retained voting rights. A clean, irrevocable transfer that would give Avery majority control of her own company. She read it twice to make sure she understood what she was looking at.
51%, she said. That gives me controlling interest.
That's the idea.
And you'd keep 2%.
A minority position, no board authority, no operational control, just enough to maintain a legal relationship with the company in case you ever need my resources. Avery stared at the document. The sunset light was fading, and the lamppost above her cast a warm yellow glow across the pages. She could see every clause, every carefully drafted paragraph, every signature line waiting for her pen.
"You're giving me my company back,"
she said quietly. "I'm giving you what was always yours. I just held it for a while." She looked up at him. He was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, his expression open in a way she had rarely seen. The walls were down. The calculated composure, the unreadable stillness, the carefully maintained distance, all of it was gone. What was left was a man standing on a riverwalk at sunset, offering everything he had taken and asking for nothing in return.
"Why?"
she asked.
"Because you earned it. Because the company runs better with you in full control than it ever could under a shared authority structure. And because I made a promise to myself when I bought that controlling stake, that the moment you were ready to carry it alone, I would step back."
"And if I sign this and walk away from you entirely? If I take the stock and cut all ties with the Vance Syndicate?"
"Then you walk away, and I respect that. And Hayes Logistics operates independently from this point forward." Avery held the document in both hands. The paper was heavy, good stock, the kind that law firms used for agreements they expected to last. She ran her thumb along the edge and felt the crisp precision of every page. She thought about her grandfather, about the handshake in a Newark diner 19 years ago that had started all of this.
About a man who judged people by their word, who honored deals with a firm grip and a steady eye, who believed that integrity was the only currency that never lost its value. She thought about Damon at the airport, quiet and amused, while a 6-pound Yorkie barked at his Rottweiler. Damon in the boardroom, placing the appointment letter in front of her with absolute confidence in her ability. Damon at the port, dismantling a corrupt dock manager with nothing but facts and composure. Damon at the cafe, telling her about a debt of respect that had shaped his entire approach to her family's legacy. Damon at the gala, standing beside her and tearing apart 3 corporate rivals who had dared to question her worth. Damon on the rooftop, offering her the door when he had every reason to keep it closed. Damon at the rail yard, driving through the dust to protect cargo and the woman who had coordinated it. Every single moment pointed in the same direction. She folded the document in half. Then she took the bottom corner between her fingers and tore it cleanly down the center. Damon watched her without moving. She tore it again, and again. 4 clean rips until the transfer agreement was nothing but a handful of heavy paper strips fluttering in the evening breeze off the Hudson.
"I don't want my company back," Avery said. "I want a partner."
She let the torn pieces fall from her hands. They scattered across the promenade and drifted toward the seawall, carried by the river wind.
"Full partnership," she continued. "Equal authority. Your network, my operations. Your protection, my logistics expertise. We build something together that neither of us could build alone. That's the only deal I'm interested in."
Damon looked at the torn paper on the ground. Then he looked at Avery. The lamppost light caught his eyes, and she saw it again. That deep, quiet warmth buried far beneath the surface, rising now like heat through bedrock. "You're sure?" he said.
"I've never been more sure of anything."
For a long moment, the only sound was the river and the distant hum of Manhattan across the water. Thor sat patiently at Damon's side. Barnaby had curled up against Thor's front leg as if it were the most natural resting place in the world. Damon extended his hand. Avery took it. His grip was firm and steady and warm, and he held on for exactly 1 beat longer than a business handshake required. When he let go, the corner of his mouth lifted into that rare, barely visible expression she had first seen at the Brooklyn Cafe, the one that looked like it cost him something to allow. "Partners," he said. They stood there on the Hoboken waterfront as the last of the sunset disappeared behind the skyline. 2 people and 2 dogs watching the lights of New York City flicker on, one by one. And for the first time in 17 days, the silence between them felt like it belonged there. The invitation had been the talk of Manhattan for a week, printed on heavyweight ivory cardstock with embossed lettering in matte black and gold. It arrived in the offices of every major logistics firm, financial institution, and media outlet on the Eastern Seaboard. No RSVP required, no dress code specified, just an address on Wall Street, a date, a time, and 2 names printed side by side at the bottom in clean, confident type. Hayes Vance Alliance, official launch, 8 p.m. The venue was the top 3 floors of a newly acquired building at the southern tip of Manhattan, a limestone and glass tower that had been quietly purchased, renovated, and rebranded in under 2 weeks. The lobby had been transformed into a reception hall with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking New York Harbor. The Statue of Liberty was visible from the cocktail bar. The Brooklyn Bridge framed the eastern windows like a postcard someone had hung for dramatic effect. Avery stood in front of a mirror in the private office on the top floor, adjusting the collar of her ivory blazer. She had chosen her own outfit this time, a tailored ivory suit with a silk blouse the color of champagne, paired with simple gold earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. She looked sharp, composed, and entirely in command, which was exactly what she intended. Barnaby was sitting on the leather couch behind her, wearing a miniature bow tie that Gloria from the Brooklyn Cafe had custom-ordered from a pet boutique in Park Slope. He looked ridiculous, and he knew it, but he also seemed to understand that tonight was important because he was sitting unusually still and hadn't tried to chew the bow tie off even once. There was a knock at the door. "Come in." Collier stepped inside, tablet in hand, his expression carrying the closest thing to excitement she had ever seen on his perpetually neutral face. 312 confirmed attendees. Every major financial outlet has a crew downstairs. The podium is set. Mr. Vance is in the East Wing with his security team reviewing the final floor plan. "Thank you, Collier." He nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "Ms. Hayes, for what it's worth, your grandfather would have been proud of what you've built here." The words landed softly in the quiet room. Avery looked at him, surprised. In 3 weeks of working together, Collier had never once offered a personal comment. "Thank you," she said again, and meant it differently this time. She picked up Barnaby, tucked him under her arm, and walked out into the hallway. The main event floor was already buzzing when she arrived. The 300 guests filled the space with a low, steady hum of conversation, clinking glasses, and the subtle background music of a jazz trio stationed near the windows. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and artfully arranged appetizers. Camera crews from 4 networks had set up along the perimeter, their lights adding a warm glow to the already golden room. Avery scanned the crowd and found the faces she expected. Howard Kessler near the bar, looking 10 years younger than he had at that first emergency board meeting, shaking hands with investors who suddenly wanted to be associated with Hayes Logistics again. Greer, the terminal manager from Pennsylvania, standing uncomfortably in a suit that clearly wasn't his natural habitat, talking to a group of Port Authority officials. Even Gloria had been invited, and she was near the dessert table, examining the pastries with the critical eye of a woman who knew a good croissant from a mediocre one. And then she saw Damon. He was standing near the podium at the far end of the room, dressed in a midnight black suit that fit him like it had been sewn directly onto his frame. His hair was pushed back, his jaw was clean-shaven, and he was speaking with 2 men in expensive suits who were nodding at everything he said with the careful enthusiasm of people who understood exactly who they were talking to. Thor was lying at his feet, massive and calm, his dark eyes scanning the room with a watchful patience that mirrored his owner's. Avery set Barnaby down on the floor and unclipped his leash. The Yorkie trotted across the polished marble with purpose, weaving between legs and shoes and champagne flutes, heading directly for the Rottweiler. When he arrived, he circled Thor once, then settled down beside him, pressing his tiny body against Thor's front leg and resting his chin on his paws. 300 people in the room, and the two dogs found each other in under a minute.
Damon looked down at the dogs, then across the room at Avery. Their eyes met across 60 feet of marble and golden light and 300 guests, and something passed between them that didn't need words or documents or handshakes to make it real. Avery walked to the podium. The room quieted as she stepped up to the microphone. Cameras pivoted, conversations faded, 300 faces turned toward her, and for a single breath, she felt the full weight of the moment settle onto her shoulders. 20 days, from a cold airport runway to this gleaming room on Wall Street, from a barking Yorkie to a partnership that was about to reshape the logistics industry on the eastern seaboard.
My grandfather started Hayes Logistics with one delivery truck and a handshake, she began. He believed that a company was only as strong as the relationships it was built on. That trust was more valuable than any contract, and that the people you chose to stand beside mattered more than the size of your fleet or the numbers on your balance sheet. She paused and looked at Damon. He was watching her from the side of the podium, his arms folded, his expression carrying that quiet, steady focus she had come to rely on more than she would have imagined possible 3 weeks ago. Tonight, I'm proud to announce the launch of the Hayes-Vance Alliance, a full partnership that combines 3 generations of logistics excellence with the most powerful private network on the eastern seaboard. Together, we will build something that neither company could achieve alone: faster routes, stronger infrastructure, and an operation that puts integrity at the center of every decision. The room applauded. Camera flashes lit up the windows like silent fireworks. Avery stepped back from the microphone, and Damon stepped forward. He didn't speak long. He never did. He thanked the guests, outlined the Alliance's first quarter objectives in 3 crisp sentences, and concluded with a line that made several journalists in the front row look up from their notebooks.
Ms. Hayes told me once that owning 53% of her company didn't mean I owned her, he said. She was right. She can't be owned. She can only be partnered with. And I consider that the most valuable deal I've ever made. The applause was louder this time. Avery felt heat rise in her cheeks, and she pressed her lips together to keep from smiling too wide. The formal portion of the evening dissolved into mingling and music, and the particular energy that fills a room when people sense they are witnessing the beginning of something significant. Investors approached Avery with business cards. Reporters requested interviews. Howard Kessler found her near the bar and hugged her without saying a word, which, from a 71-year-old man who had known her since birth, said everything. At 9:30, the crowd began to thin. The jazz trio shifted into something slower. The camera crews packed up their equipment. The golden light in the room softened as the overhead fixtures dimmed and the city lights outside the windows took over, casting long blue reflections across the marble floor. Avery found herself standing near the eastern windows, looking out at the Brooklyn Bridge, holding a glass of champagne she had barely touched. Barnaby was asleep on a velvet chair nearby, his bow tie finally askew. Thor was lying beside the chair, one massive paw resting on the armrest, as if he had appointed himself the Yorkie's personal guardian for the evening. Damon appeared beside her. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, shoulder almost touching hers, looking out at the same view.
Your grandfather's truck, he said after a while.
The first one. Do you know what happened to it?
Avery smiled.
It's in a storage unit in Newark. He kept it, said he'd never sell it because it was proof that everything big starts small.
Smart man.
The smartest I ever knew. She glanced at him. Until recently. Damon looked at her. The city light caught his eyes the same way the cafe sunlight had that Sunday morning in Brooklyn, turning the dark brown to amber at the edges. He reached down and took her hand. His fingers closed around hers, steady and warm, and he held on without squeezing, without pulling, without any of the force or authority that defined every other part of his life. He simply held her hand and let it mean what it meant. Avery didn't pull away.
They stood together at the window, the city stretched out before them in a million points of light, 2 dogs sleeping peacefully behind them, and the name Hayes Vance glowing in gold letters on the building's lobby wall 40 floors below. Everything big starts small. Sometimes it starts with a 6-pound Yorkie picking a fight with a Rottweiler on a cold New Jersey runway. And sometimes that's exactly where it's supposed to begin.